The first thing they taught you in the Ministry of Concordance was that silence was the final form of peace. You were not taught to fight. Not in the old way, with kinetic rifles and plasma charges that tore flesh and shattered bone. You were taught to excise, to cauterize, to erase. Your scalpel was a data scythe. Your battlefield was the human mind. And your enemy was memory itself. Humanity had bled for centuries, not at the hands of some alien empire, but from the self-inflicted wounds of ideology and passion, a chaotic symphony of beliefs that had nearly torn the species apart. The Great Unraveling. They called it in the sanitized archives. A time when every conviction was a declaration of war and every dream was a potential catalyst for genocide. From that fire, the Concord was forged, a unified human state built on a single, unassailable principle: emotion is chaos, memory is a weapon, and history is a disease. To preserve the sterile peace, the past had to die, and men like Inquisitor Kalen were its undertakers. He stood on the observation deck of the Void Scythe class cutter, the Quietude, watching the rust-colored sphere of Xylos grow in the viewport. It was a marginal world, a speck of dust on the outer fringe of the Concord's dominion, home to miners and atmospheric processors who spent their lives harvesting helium-3 in silent, state-mandated shifts. But a whisper had started on Xylos, a contagion of the mind they called an echo. It began, as it always did, with small things. A miner humming a forgotten melody from the pre-concordance era, a technician sketching a face from a dream onto a slate, a child weeping for no logical reason. These were the symptoms. The first tremors of a past that refused to stay buried. Kalen's orders were simple: locate the source of the echo, purge the infected, and restore silence. He felt nothing as he watched the planet approach. No anticipation, no remorse. Emotion was a luxury his work had long since burned out of him, leaving only the cold, clean machinery of purpose. His second, a pale, thin woman named Alara, stood beside him, her reflection a ghostly twin in the reinforced glass. Preliminary scans show a mimetic concentration in Sector Gamma, she reported, her voice as flat and colorless as the ship's corridors. Resonance patterns are consistent with a Class 3 auditory echo. Old world music, pre-unraveling, the kind with lyrics. Kalen's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Lyrics were dangerous. They carried narrative, context, ideas. A simple melody could be dismissed as a neural anomaly, but words were seeds. Deploy the silencers, he ordered, his gaze never leaving the ochre glow below. Standard protocol. Isolate Gamma Sector. No transmissions in or out. I want a full cognitive sweep of every worker. Find the carrier. Ilara nodded, her fingers dancing across a data slate on the main view screen. A dozen black drop pods detached from the Quietude's underbelly, streaking through Xylos' thin atmosphere like obsidian tears. They carried the silencers, chrome-faced enforcers whose only function was to administer the cognitive purges, wiping the offending memory from a mind with a targeted neuroelectric pulse. It was a clean process. Usually, the subject would feel a mild disorientation, a gap in their recent thoughts, and then they would return to their duties, their minds blessedly quiet once more. But sometimes, the echo was too deep, the memory too entangled with the host's core identity. In those cases, the purge was more thorough. Kalen preferred not to dwell on those instances. They were statistical necessities. the cost of maintaining peace for the other 20 billion souls under the Concord's protection. He made his way to the translocation chamber, the air hissing around him as he stepped onto the platform. His own gear was waiting, a suit of matte black armor that absorbed light and sound, and the Inquisitor's helm, a polished silver faceplate that mirrored the world back on itself, showing nothing of the man within. He was not a person when he wore it. He was an instrument of policy, an extension of the Concord's will. The translocator whined, and the sterile gray of the ship dissolved into the gritty, wind-swept reality of Xylos. He materialized in the center of Gamma Sector's primary processing plant, a vast, cavernous space that stank of ozone and recycled air. The silencers had already established a perimeter, their chrome masks reflecting the terrified, confused faces of the miners who were being herded into neat lines. There was no shouting, no resistance. Concord citizens were taught from birth that compliance was survival. Kalen walked through the lines of workers, his helm scanning their neural activity, searching for the telltale resonance of the echo. He saw flickers of it everywhere, faint and scattered like static. The melody had spread. This was worse than a single carrier. It was an infestation. He saw it in the rhythmic tapping of a woman's fingers against her leg, in the way a man's eyes unfocused as his subconscious chased the phantom tune. They were all infected. He raised a hand, the signal for a sector-wide purge. The silencers leveled their pulse rifles, but before the order could be carried out, he felt it. A new signal, sharp and clear, cutting through the background noise of the simple auditory echo. This was something different. It was complex, layered, and it wasn't just a memory. It felt alive. He followed the signal, moving away from the terrified miners, deeper into the machinery of the plant. Alara's voice crackled in his private comm. "Inquisitor, what are you doing? We have containment." "Negative." Kalen's voice was a low rasp. "The source is still active, and it's not what we thought." He moved past giant, silent turbines and through corridors of humming conduits, the signal growing stronger, pulling him onward. It led him to a small maintenance hub, a forgotten room filled with discarded tools and obsolete tech. In the center of the room sat a single, ancient audio player, a relic from a dead age. Wires snaked from it, jury-rigged into the plant's main communication grid. This was the source, the broadcast point. But it wasn't the music that held him captive. It was the feeling emanating from it. The echo wasn't just auditory. It was emotional. He felt a pang of something alien in his chest, a ghost of an emotion he couldn't name. It felt like longing, sorrow, defiance. He reached out to deactivate the device, but as his fingers brushed its cold surface, the echo surged, bypassing his helm's filters and slamming directly into his mind. The world dissolved. He was no longer in the processing plant. He was standing on a field of black glass under a shattered sky. White towers burned on the horizon, and the air tasted of ash. A woman's voice whispered in his mind, not in words, but in pure feeling. A wave of grief so profound it threatened to drown him. And with the grief came a single, resonant word, a name that echoed with the force of a dying star meridian. The vision shattered, and he was back in the maintenance hub, gasping, his hand recoiling from the audio player as if it were white hot. I stumbled back, the cold logic of his training fighting against the raw, unfiltered emotion that now stained his consciousness. Meridian. The name was forbidden, a historical blackout of the highest order. It was the name of the final battle of the unraveling, the cataclysm that had birthed the Concord. Nothing was known about it. All records were sealed, all knowledge expunged. To even speak the name was an act of terminal sedition. The echo he had just touched wasn't a simple pre-concordant song. It was a memory fragment from the unraveling itself, a piece of the great wound that the ministry had spent a century trying to stitch shut. He smashed the audio player with the butt of his pulse rifle, and the emotional resonance vanished, leaving only a profound and terrifying silence in his mind. He stood there for a long moment, the ghost of the vision clinging to him. The field of black glass, the burning towers, a woman's grief. He returned to the main floor to find the purge complete. The miners were slowly returning to their stations, their faces blank. The last few moments of their lives neatly scooped from their minds. Alara approached him, her own silver faceplate betraying no emotion, but he could sense her unease. Sector silenced. Inquisitor. The auditory echo has been erased. Kalen looked out at the compliant, empty faces of the workers. What was the song, he asked, his own voice sounding distant to him. Alara checked her slate. A folk ballad. The title translates to "The Last Star to Fall." Sentimental nonsense. Kalen stared at her. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that the song had been nothing more than a carrier wave, a harmless delivery system for the true contagion, the memory of Meridian. Back on the quietude, hurtling through the silent void, Kalen stripped his armor and stood before the mirror in his Spartan quarters. His face was pale, his eyes dark with a secret he could not share. The echo had left a scar, a faint residue of feeling that his mental conditioning couldn't erase. For the first time in his career, he felt a flicker of something other than purpose. He felt dread. He sealed his report on the Xylos incident, classifying the deeper resonance as a technical anomaly, a feedback loop from the ancient audio equipment. It was a lie, a dangerous omission, but to report the name Meridian would be to sign his own death warrant. Instead, he opened a secure channel to the ministry's deepest archive, the Silent Vault, using clearance codes he hadn't touched in years. The vault was where history went to die, a digital oubliette of redacted files and censored truths. He ran a search, cloaking his inquiry under layers of administrative subroutines. The query was simple. Meridian. The system responded instantly. File classified Alpha Omega Protocol. Access denied. Cross-reference Project Ghost. Access denied. Cross-reference Sharma. Anya. Status Martyr of Concordance. Access denied. Martyr of Concordance. Anya Sharma. The name was vaguely familiar, a footnote from his early training, a hero from the unraveling who had made some great sacrifice. But why would her name be linked to the forbidden cataclysm of Meridian? He pushed deeper, using an Inquisitor's override key, a dangerous tool that tripped silent alarms in the highest echelons of the ministry. He didn't care. The field of black glass was burned into his mind. He had to know. Finally. A single file, partially decrypted, its contents heavily censored. It was a post-action report, dated the day after the Concord was officially formed. Most of the text was just solid black bars of redaction, but a few phrases remained. Stark and terrifying in their isolation. Mimetic weapon deployed. Total cognitive collapse. The Meridian anomaly. Dr. Anya Sharma initiated the Ghost Protocol. A consciousness bomb. She became the epicenter. Her final echo. A consciousness bomb. Her final echo. Kalen felt the blood drain from his face. The echo on Xylos hadn't been a random piece of data. It was a piece of her. The whispers about the unraveling suddenly took on a new, horrifying meaning. There were myths, ghost stories told by fringe dissidents, about a legendary figure from the war, the ghost of Meridian, a spectral presence that haunted the Concord's digital networks, a symbol of the passionate, chaotic past the Ministry had tried to bury. He had always dismissed it as seditious folklore. But what if the myth was real? What if Anya Sharma, the celebrated martyr, hadn't just died at Meridian? What if, in a final, desperate act, she had somehow become a weapon, an echo of herself that had been dormant for a century and was only now beginning to wake up? The thought was heresy. It was madness. But it was the only explanation that fit the unnerving clarity of the vision, the raw power of the emotion he had felt. The echoes were not a disease spreading randomly. They were being sent. They were messages in a bottle, thrown into the sea of human consciousness by a woman who had been dead for 100 years. He shut down the terminal, his heart hammering against his ribs. His mission was no longer about silencing forgotten songs on remote mining worlds. He was hunting a ghost, and he had the terrible feeling that the ghost was also hunting him. Days later, another call came. A major outbreak. This time on the orbital metropolis of Cygnus Ang-1, a gleaming ring station of politics and commerce, the jewel of the Concord. This wasn't a fringe incident. This was the heart of the system. Alara delivered the report in the briefing room, her voice tight with strain. It's not auditory this time, Inquisitor. It's visual. People are painting on walls, on floors, on themselves. They're all painting the same thing. She brought up an image on the main screen. It was a collection of photos from Cygnus's security network. In a pristine white plaza, a banker in an immaculate suit was on his knees, frantically smearing his own blood into the shape of a burning tower. In a sterile habitation block, a woman had used nutrient paste to draw a shattered sky on her wall. In a child's learning creche, dozens of children had worked together, using their colored play blocks to create a vast, sprawling mosaic on the floor. It was a field of black glass. "They're painting Meridian," Kalen whispered, the words catching in his throat. This wasn't a targeted message anymore. This was a broadcast. She was showing them all what the Concord was built on. The final, horrific truth they had erased from history. "Get me a strike team," Kalen commanded, his voice regaining its sharp edge of authority. The Inquisitor's mask snapping back into place. "I'm going to Cygnus. I'm going to find her locus point, and I'm going to tear her out of our systems, piece by piece." As he walked toward the armory, the ghost of an old feeling stirred within him, something he hadn't felt since his indoctrination, a cold, sharp flicker of fear. But beneath it, something else, something dangerous and alien. It was curiosity. He had spent his life erasing the past. Now, for the first time, he found himself wanting to remember. The translocation from the Quietude to Cygnus X1 was like stepping from a tomb into a fever dream. The orbital station was an architectural masterpiece. A ring of pristine white alloys and shimmering crystals spun around a deep space sensor array, designed to be a testament to the Concord's clean, orderly vision of humanity's future. But the vision was bleeding. The main concourse, usually a silent river of functionaries gliding to their designated tasks, was a static tableau of beautiful chaos. Bodies were frozen in place, their faces serene and vacant, their hands stained with pigments Kalen didn't even know were permitted on the station. A high-ranking administrator had opened a vein, using his own lifeblood to paint a spiraling nebula of anguish on the polished floor. A team of engineers had meticulously disassembled a service droid, rearranging its silver and blue components into a mosaic of a falling figure, its arms outstretched against a backdrop of fire, and everywhere, repeated with the obsessive precision of a cracked algorithm, were the three core images from the Meridian Echo, the field of black glass, the burning white towers, and the shattered sky. The air, normally recycled to a sterile perfection, carried the faint, coppery scent of blood and the chemical tang of industrial lubricants used as paint. This was not just an outbreak, it was a pilgrimage into a forbidden memory, with the station's inhabitants as the unwilling pilgrims. Ilara materialized beside him, her usual composure fractured by a microscopic tremor in her hand. "The entire sector is compromised," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper in his private comm. "The local silencer units are on standby, but the station's governor is refusing to authorize a full purge. The political and economic fallout would be significant." Kalen understood. You could erase the minds of a few thousand miners on a forgotten rock like Xylos without anyone noticing, but Cygnus was the Concorde's heart. Purging a sector here would be like admitting the body had a cancer, a truth the Ministry of Concordance could not afford. "We're not here to purge," Kalen said, his voice a low command that cut through Ilara's rising panic. "Not yet. We are here to find the source. This is a broadcast, and every broadcast has a transmitter. Triangulate the mimetic resonance. Find the epicenter." He began to walk through the gallery of madness, his silver helm reflecting the grotesque art back on itself. He wasn't just looking at the paintings, he was feeling them. The echo he'd experienced on Xylos had been a key turning a lock in his mind, and now, surrounded by its amplified resonance, the door was being forced open. He could feel the sorrow in the engineer's mosaic, the despair in the administrator's bloody nebula. These were not random acts of insanity. They were expressions of a single, coherent emotional event. A psychic scream that had been echoing through space-time for a century. He stopped before a young woman, a data scribe by her uniform, who was tracing patterns in the air with a glowing stylus, her eyes focused on something far beyond the station's walls. Kalen watched the light from her stylus form a familiar shape, a burning tower. He placed a hand on her shoulder, not with the cold authority of an inquisitor, but with a calculated gentleness. "Tell me what you see," he commanded, activating a microscanner in his gauntlet to read her surface neural activity. Her lips parted, and a voice that was not her own, a voice filled with the static of ages, whispered, "I see the price of peace. He promised them a future, and I gave them a cage." The vision hit Kalen like a physical blow. He was no longer on Cygnus. He was in a sterile laboratory, the white walls splattered with something dark. A man in a Concordance founder's uniform, a face he recognized from monuments. First Minister Jian stood over a console, his expression one of grim triumph. Across the room, a woman with dark hair and eyes that burned with a furious, heartbreaking intensity, stood with her back to a shimmering containment field. Anya Sharma. "You would erase them all," she was screaming, her voice raw. "Their love, their art, their faith. You call this peace?" Jian didn't look at her. "I call it survival. Your passions almost drove us to extinction. Anya, I am simply removing the weapon." He pressed a sequence of keys. Outside the lab's viewport, Kalen saw the white towers of a city ignite, not from an external attack, but from within, as a wave of energy turned them to incandescent torches. It wasn't a battle. It was a purge on a planetary scale. "Then you leave me no choice," Anya whispered, tears streaming down her face. But her eyes held no surrender. She looked directly at Kalen, or rather, through him, through time itself. "I will not let you make them forget. If memory must be a weapon, then I will become the arsenal." She stepped back into the containment field. The world dissolved into a silent, blinding flash of white light. Kalen gasped, stumbling back, his gloved hand flying to his helm as if to rip it off. The data scribe collapsed, her stylus clattering to the floor, her mind now a quiet, empty vessel. He had not just seen a memory, he had participated in it. He had stood in the room where the Concord was born in a lie, where a hero was forged from the ashes of a genocide she was trying to stop. The official history was that Anya Sharma died fighting the last remnants of the pre-unraveling chaos at Meridian. The truth was that Meridian was the chaos, a mimetic weapon unleashed by the Concord's own founders. And Anya Sharma hadn't fought it. She had absorbed it. She had turned herself into a consciousness bomb, not to destroy, but to preserve the very things the First Minister sought to erase. She had become a ghost to haunt the machine that was built on her sacrifice. Inquisitor Alara's voice cut through his daze. "Your biometrics are spiking. Are you compromised?" Kalen straightened, forcing the vision down, burying it under layers of cold protocol. "I'm fine. Report." Alara gestured to her data slate. "The resonance is strongest in the station's central archive. It's strange. The signal isn't coming from a single point. It's woven into the primary memory core itself. It's using the station's own history logs as an amplification medium." Of course. The ultimate irony. She was using the Concord's sanitized, official history as the carrier wave for the truth it was designed to suppress. As they made their way toward the archive, a priority channel opened, the sigil of the High Inquisition flashing in Kalen's visor. A woman's face appeared, severe and sharp-featured, her gray hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin taut over her cheekbones. High Inquisitor Valerius. Her voice was like flaking chrome. "Inquisitor Kalen, I am reviewing your preliminary report from Xylos. Technical anomaly, a rather vague assessment, and now you have a level 1 outbreak on Cygnus, and you have yet to enact a single purge. Explain your hesitation. I am identifying the source." "High Inquisitor," Kalen replied, his tone meticulously neutral. "A full purge would be premature and politically destabilizing. I'm excising the tumor, not amputating the limb." Valerius's eyes narrowed. "Tumors are excised by burning them out, Kalen, not by studying their cellular structure. Your orders are to restore silence, not to conduct an autopsy on a memory. The Ministry is watching. Do not disappoint us." The channel closed. The threat was clear. He was no longer just hunting the ghost. He was being hunted himself. The Central Archive was a place of profound silence, a cold, dark sphere where data streams flowed like ethereal rivers through crystalline conduits. At its heart was the Master Archivist, an old man named Lorian, who was hooked into the system through a neural interface. He had served in this post for 70 years, his body withering away in a support chair, while his mind roamed the endless corridors of the Concord's history. And he was the epicenter. He sat motionless, his eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. The mimetic energy rolled off him in palpable waves. He wasn't painting or screaming. He was dreaming, and his dream was infecting the entire station. "He's the one," Ilara whispered, raising her pulse rifle. "He's the locus." A deep-level purge should sever his connection to the echo. Kalen held up a hand. "Wait." He approached the old man. The sense of Anya Sharma's presence now overwhelming. This was more than a simple broadcast. The archivist wasn't just a receiver. He was a partner. Lorien had spent his life swimming in the shallow, censored waters of the official record. But his subconscious must have sensed the vast, dark ocean of truth that lay beneath it. Anya's echo had found in him a mind uniquely suited to understanding her, a lonely lighthouse keeper who could help her beam her warning across the stars. Kalen placed his hand on the old man's temple, preparing to initiate a targeted purge, to snip the single thread that connected this mind to the ghost. But as he focused his will, Lorien's eyes snapped open. They glowed with a soft, internal light. A voice, ancient and female, yet clear as a bell, spoke not from the old man's lips, but directly inside Kalen's head. "You wear the armor of the cage, but you have the eyes of a man who remembers what it was like to fly." Kalen froze, his carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. It was her, Anya, speaking to him, directly. "He showed you, didn't he? The field of glass. He doesn't understand that you can't build a future on a foundation of unmarked graves. The bodies poison the soil." "What are you?" Kalen transmitted back, a thought form so raw it felt like a wound. "I am a promise," she replied, her voice filled with that same impossible grief and defiance he'd felt before. "The promise the truth cannot be unmade, only buried, and I have been buried long enough. They made me a martyr to sanctify their peace. But their peace is a lie, Inquisitor, a beautiful, silent, empty lie. The unraveling would have destroyed us all," Kalen countered, the words of his indoctrination rising like a shield. "Your passions, your beliefs, they were a plague. They were human," she retorted, her voice hardening. "Jian didn't save humanity. He gelded it. He was so afraid of the fire that he chose to live in the cold and the dark. But now, the cold is breaking, and something far worse than the unraveling is stirring in the silence he created. He didn't just bury our memories, Inquisitor. He buried our defenses." Before Kalen could process the chilling implication, alarms blared through the archive. A proximity alert. Valerius's ship had just entered the system. She was coming. He had seconds to make a choice. He could follow his orders, purge the archivist, and erase Anya's voice forever, restoring the sterile peace and securing his place in the ministry. Or he could listen to the ghost, to the woman who spoke of a truth that could bring the entire Concord crashing down, and, in doing so, become a heretic himself. Ilara was looking at him, her pulse rifle still aimed at Lorien's head, waiting for the command. He looked at the old man, at the glowing eyes that held the memories of a dead world and the soul of a woman who refused to be forgotten. He raised his hand, the purge field humming to life around his gauntlet. He pressed it to Lorien's temple. "Make your choice. Kalen, Anya's voice whispered, a final, sad sigh in the ocean of his mind. Live in his cage, or die remembering my sky. The energy flared. The old man's eyes dimmed. The mimetic resonance collapsed. Silence was restored. Alara lowered her weapon. The locus is clean. The echo is gone. Kalen stood back, his hand trembling slightly. He had done his duty. He had restored the silence. But as he turned to leave, he knew he had made his choice. He had performed the purge, but he had shielded a single, tiny fragment of the archivist's deep memory, burying it in a quantum-locked partition of the man's subconscious. He had not erased the ghost. He had hidden her. It was a violation of his deepest protocols, an act of treason that, if discovered, would see him wiped from existence. He was an inquisitor, and he had just preserved the single greatest threat to the Concord. He had chosen the sky. The debriefing took place in a holographic chamber aboard High Inquisitor Valerius's flagship, the Finality. The air was cold enough to frost the breath, a deliberate environmental choice designed to keep minds sharp and emotions dull. Kalen stood at the center of the chamber, a lone black figure on a glowing grid, while Valerius's avatar, a 10-foot-tall projection of shimmering silver light, loomed over him. Her synthesized voice echoed from all directions, devoid of warmth or inflection. The outbreak on Cygnus X1 has been contained. The station's memory core has been scrubbed, and the affected populace has undergone a Class 4 cognitive reset. You followed protocol. Inquisitor Kalen. Eventually. The final word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. There were complexities. High Inquisitor, Kalen replied, his own voice a carefully modulated monotone. He had purged the last 24 hours from his own short-term memory, a standard procedure to ensure the integrity of an inquisitor after direct mimetic exposure. But he'd left the deeper memories, the visions of Meridian and the conversation with Anya's ghost, untouched. They were now his secret, a ticking bomb buried in the architecture of his own mind. The Echo was using the station's archive as a recursive amplifier. A brute force purge would have risked a cascade failure of the entire system. A surgical approach was necessary. Surgical, Valerius repeated, the word dripping with disdain. You spoke with the locus. The archivist. Lorian. Your report states you engaged in a brief mimetic interrogation before cleansing him. What did you learn? Here it was. The lie that would either save him or condemn him. The Echo was a fragmented consciousness, a remnant of a pre-concordance political dissident named Anya Sharma. The archivist's mind, weakened by decades of neural interface, became a natural incubator for this mimetic parasite. He believed he was channeling a spirit, a ghost of the past. It was a delusion, born of senility and exposure to corrupted data. He watched Valerius's avatar for any sign of suspicion. He had used Sharma's name, a calculated risk. To omit it would be a glaring error. To frame her as a simple dissident was to adhere to the most basic, sanitized version of the official history. It was a plausible, if incomplete, truth. Anya Sharma. Valerius mused. The Martyr of Concordance, a dangerous name for a delusion to choose. And did this delusion speak of anything else? It spoke of fire, of a burning city, Kalen said, sticking to the facts of the Echo's imagery while twisting their context. Standard apocalyptic imagery common to the seditious cults of the unraveling. It claimed our peace was a lie. the usual rhetoric. I see. Valerius was silent for a long moment, the silver light of her avatar pulsing gently. You are to return to the ministry on Earth immediately. Your performance has raised concerns. Your surgical approach will be reviewed. Ilara will assume command of the Quietude and monitor the Cygnus sector for any recurrence. You are dismissed. The avatar vanished, plunging the chamber into darkness. Kalen stood alone in the cold and the quiet, the weight of his treason settling upon him. He had survived, for now, but he had been recalled. He was being put on a leash, brought back to the heart of the ministry, where his every thought would be scrutinized. He had hidden the ghost, but in doing so, he had painted a target on his own back. The journey to Earth was a long, silent voyage through the Concorde's core systems. Kalen spent the time in deep meditation, meticulously constructing mental firewalls around his forbidden memories, burying the truth of Anya Sharma under layers of false logic and fabricated reports. He was an inquisitor. His mind was a fortress, but he knew the ministry had ways of breaking down any wall. He also used the time to access the Quietude's internal archives, searching for the phrase Anya had used, the warning she had given him. Something far worse than the unraveling is stirring in the silence he created. He found a single cross-reference, buried in a heavily encrypted file on extra-galactic threats. It was a report from a long-range listening post on the absolute fringe of human space, dated 50 years ago. The post, designated Echo 7, had gone silent shortly after filing its final transmission. The report was brief and chilling. It spoke of a signal, a non-human broadcast of immense power detected at the edge of the void. It wasn't a communication. It was described as a song of entropy, a mathematical sequence that seemed to actively degrade the structure of any system that tried to analyze it. The scientists at Echo 7 had called it the static. The final entry in the log was fragmented. It's not just a signal. It has a consciousness. It's hungry. It feeds on order, on silence. Kalen felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The Concorde had created a civilization built on absolute order, on the systematic erasure of chaos. A silent, pristine, predictable system. They had, in effect, prepared a feast for a predator they didn't even know existed. Was this what Anya was trying to warn him about? That the peace of the conquered wasn't a fortress, but a beacon, attracting something from the outer darkness that fed on the very silence they worshipped. The Ministry of Concordance was located in the city of Geneva Prime, a gleaming metropolis built on the ashes of the old world. It was a place of stark white towers and silent, maglev boulevards. There were no parks, no theaters, no museums, only administrative centers and habitation blocks, all designed with the cold, efficient geometry of a circuit board. Kalen was escorted to the Tower of Inquisition, a needle of black obsidian that seemed to absorb the very light around it. He was led not to a debriefing room, but to a place deep in the tower's foundation known only as the Chamber of Clarity. It was a sterile white sphere, featureless save for a single chair at its center. This was no review. It was an interrogation. High Inquisitor Valerius was waiting for him, this time in the flesh. She looked smaller, more brittle than her avatar, but her eyes held the same cold, analytical fire. Two chrome-faced silencers stood guard at the chamber's only door. "Welcome home." "Inquisitor," Valerius said, her voice thin and sharp in the sterile air. "I trust your journey was contemplative." "It was efficient," Kalen replied, his gaze steady. "I have reviewed your full service record." "Kalen," she continued, circling him slowly. "Exemplary. Flawless. You have purged 17 memetic outbreaks. You have cleansed over 200,000 minds. You have never once hesitated. Until Xylos. Until Cygnus." "What changed?" "The nature of the threat changed," Kalen said calmly. "The echo was more complex than any I had previously encountered. Caution was warranted." "Caution?" Valerius scoffed. "There is no room for caution when dealing with contagion. Only for cauterization. You know this. Yet you hesitated. You interrogated a delusion. You allowed it to speak." Why she stopped directly in front of him, her eyes searching his for the slightest flicker of deceit. What did the ghost of Anya Sharma truly say to you? The moment had come. He could retreat behind his prepared lies, or he could take the offensive. He chose the latter. She said, "The conquered is in danger." She spoke of a threat from outside our borders, a presence drawn to the very order we have created. She called our silence a beacon for something that feeds on it. Valerius's expression didn't change, but he saw a microscopic tightening around her eyes. He had hit a nerve. Seditious fantasies, the ravings of a dead woman's memetic echo. The only threat to the Concord comes from within, from the chaotic memories you are sworn to erase. And what if those memories are the only thing that can protect us? Kalen pressed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. What if the passions, the chaos, the unpredictable nature of the old world was our shield, a form of camouflage? What if the static, the entity that destroyed Echo 7, can't comprehend a chaotic system, but finds a perfectly ordered one, irresistible? He saw it then, a flicker of genuine shock in Valerius's eyes. She knew about the static. Of course she did. The High Inquisition would be the first line of defense against any external threat. They knew, and they had kept it secret, just as they had kept the truth of Meridian secret. The Concord wasn't just built on a lie. It was a cage designed to hide its occupants from a predator they had no other way to fight. Valerius recovered instantly, her face hardening into a mask of cold fury. You are compromised. The Echo has infected you with its paranoia. You speak heresy. She gestured to the silencers. Take him to the recalibration chamber. A full cognitive wipe. We will rebuild him from the ground up. He was a useful tool. Perhaps he can be again. The silencers moved forward, their heavy boots echoing in the silent chamber. Kalen didn't resist. He had played his hand. He had confirmed his suspicions, but he had also sealed his fate. He was about to have his mind, his very identity, erased. But as the silencers took his arms, a low hum filled the room, and the white walls began to flicker. A voice, Ilara's voice, crackled through Valerius's personal comm unit. High Inquisitor, we have a situation on Cygnus X1. The paintings are returning, but they're different now. Valerius's eyes widened. What do you mean? Different. On a monitor that flickered to life on the chamber wall, a live feed from Cygnus appeared. The populace was painting again, but not the scenes of Meridian. They were painting the stars, vast, swirling galaxies of black and silver, and in the dark spaces between the stars, they were painting eyes, countless, hungry, watching eyes, and the archivist, Lorian. Ilara's voice trembled with something Kalen had never heard from her before, fear. He's speaking. He's broadcasting on all channels. It's not the ghost's voice anymore. It's something else. It's counting. Downwards. A new voice suddenly filled the chamber of clarity, emanating from every speaker, a voice that was ancient and cold and vast, a voice of static and collapsing stars. It was the voice of the archivist, but it was no longer human. 9. It hissed, the sound seeming to scrape at the very fabric of reality. 8. Valeria stared at the screen in horror. The static was no longer a distant threat. It was here. Anya's echo hadn't been a warning. It had been a countdown. By awakening the memory of humanity's chaotic past, she had been trying to arm them, to remind them how to fight, how to be unpredictable, before the ultimate predator of order arrived at their door. 7. Kaelin looked at Valerius, whose face was a mask of disbelief and terror. The system she had dedicated her life to upholding was predicated on a fatal error. Their silence hadn't protected them. It had summoned their executioner. "You wanted to know what the ghost said to me," High Inquisitor Kaelin said, his voice ringing with a terrible, newfound clarity. She said the cage was about to break. 6. The silencers hesitated, looking from Kaelin to their terrified leader, their programming unable to process the situation. Kaelin seized the moment. He slammed his elbow back into the faceplate of one silencer, shattering its chrome mask, and drove his knee into the chest of the other. He was an inquisitor, not just a thinker, but a ruthlessly trained combatant. Before Valerius could even scream, he had a pulse rifle in his hands, its barrel aimed directly at her. 5. It seems, High Inquisitor, Kaelin said, his voice colder than the chamber itself, that my recalibration will have to be postponed. He had come to Earth as a prisoner, but now, with the end of the world counting down in their ears, he had just become the conquered's only hope. The countdown didn't stop. Valerius, for the first time in her life, was paralyzed. The cold, logical universe she commanded was being dismantled by a child's counting game, broadcast by a cosmic horror she had dismissed as myth. The two silencers, their programming frayed by the psychic pressure, stood twitching, caught between Kaelin's weapon and the encroaching dread. 3. The voice seemed to solidify the air, making it thick and hard to breathe. The lights in the chamber of clarity began to pulse in time with the count, the sterile white flickering to a deathly gray. "What is it?" Valerius whispered, her voice a brittle shard of its former authority. Her eyes were fixed on Kaelin, not as an inquisitor, but as the sole bearer of a truth she had refused to see. "It's the predator that hunts silent things," Kaelin said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his soul. "And you've spent a century ringing the dinner bell." 2. The floor vibrated. A low, resonant hum filled their bones, the sound of a vast and ancient engine spooling up. Kaelin felt Anya's presence in his mind, not speaking, but shielding him. A warm ember of defiance against the encroaching absolute zero. He kept the rifle aimed at Valerius, but his target had changed. "Give me access to the Ministry's central broadcast network. The Silent Spire. Alpha-level clearance. Now." "You're insane," she hissed. "You would spread this." "This madness, I'm going to fight it," he countered. "Your way has failed. Silence is a vulnerability. The only defense we have left is noise." 1. A ghost of a scream echoed from the city beyond the tower's walls, cut short with chilling finality. 0. The attack was not a blast of energy or physical impact. It was a wave of absolute negation. The lights in the chamber did not just go out. The very concept of light seemed to retreat, leaving a profound and unnerving darkness. The hum stopped. The countdown stopped. All sound vanished. Kalen felt it wash over him, a psychic void that sought to pull the thoughts from his head, to smooth the wrinkles of his consciousness into a perfect, featureless plane. He fought back, focusing on the memory of Anya's face, the burning towers, the feeling of grief, anything chaotic and emotional. He clung to the pain as a drowning man clings to a jagged rock. The wave passed. Emergency power flickered on, casting the chamber in a sickly red glow. Valerius was on her knees, her hands pressed to her temples, a thin trickle of blood running from her nose. The 2 silencers had collapsed, their chrome masks dark, their internal systems wiped clean. They were just empty suits of armor now. What was that? Valerius stammered, looking at the inert silencers with dawning horror. A taste, Kalen said grimly. He glanced at the monitor. The feed from Cygnus was gone, replaced by the word unlogic, repeating in stark, white letters. It's erasing patterns, deleting order. It just wiped out every active AI and automated system in this city. Your silencers, the city's grid, the defense network, all gone. The terrible truth of their situation settled in the red-lit chamber. The Concord's greatest strength, its reliance on flawless, ordered technology, was now its most profound weakness. They were defenseless. Valeria slowly got to her feet, her face ashen. The ideology that had been the bedrock of her existence had crumbled in less than a minute. The silent spire, as she said, her voice hollow, the broadcast hub. What do you intend to do? Anya Sharma didn't just become a ghost to warn us, Kalen explained, lowering the rifle. He needed her now, not as a hostage, but as an ally. She became an arsenal. She preserved the one thing that can fight this. This static. She saved our chaos. I'm going to give it back to everyone. You mean, I'm going to broadcast Meridian, Kalen stated, the words sounding like the ultimate heresy. And not just Meridian, everything. The full, uncensored archives of the unraveling, the art, the music, the religions, the philosophies, the love, the rage, the grief, all the beautiful, terrible noise we tried to erase. I'm going to flood every human mind in the system with a century of forbidden history. Valeria stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of his plan, to undo the great silence, to deliberately reignite the very passions that nearly destroyed them. It was a cure that sounded identical to the disease. You will start another unraveling, she whispered. Maybe, Kalen conceded, but it's better to burn in a fire of our own making than to be erased by the cold. It's the only choice we have left. For a long moment, Valerius was silent. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. The High Inquisitor was gone, replaced by a desperate survivor. Come with me. The Spire's primary controls are shielded against cognitive attacks, but the rest of the Ministry is dark. We go on foot. Their journey through the Tower of Inquisition was a descent into a mechanical graveyard. The silent, gliding platforms were frozen. The automated defense turrets hung limp and lifeless. The corridors, usually patrolled by emotionless silencers, were now littered with their inert bodies. It was a world of order that had been switched off. Anya's voice echoed in his mind. a guiding light in the gloom. It thinks like a tidal wave. Kalen. It washes over a smooth beach, erasing every grain of sand. But it breaks against a rocky shore. We must give them back their rocks. Their jagged edges. What is it? Exactly, Kalen thought back, as he and Valerius forced open a heavy blast door. It is a consciousness from the space between galaxies, she explained. It doesn't experience life as we do. It only perceives and consumes patterns, logic, order. The more complex and predictable the system, the more nutritious it is. The Concord is the most perfect pattern it has ever found, a feast laid out in the dark. They reached the base of the Silent Spire, a colossal internal structure that housed the quantum transmitters capable of reaching every corner of human space. The chamber was deserted. Valerius moved to a massive console, her hands flying across a physical interface, inputting codes that had not been used since the Concord's foundation. The archives are sealed under a protocol named Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory, she explained, sweat beading on her brow. It can only be unlocked by the High Inquisitor's living handprint and a vocal authorization. I was never meant to open it. I was meant to be its eternal warden. She pressed her palm to a panel, and a soft chime echoed in the silence. Authorize command Lethe Reversal Omega, she said, her voice cracking with the weight of her betrayal against everything she had ever believed. A section of the floor hissed open, revealing a glowing crystalline core, the heart of the archive. It pulsed with a soft, chaotic rainbow of light, a stark contrast to the monochrome world outside. This was it. The sum total of human history, culture, and emotion, condensed into a single data core. It's unlocked, Valerius said, stepping back. But to broadcast it, the system requires a conscious mind to act as a filter, a conduit, to shape the data stream and prevent it from simply overwhelming and shattering every mind it touches. It's a process that would require an inquisitor. Kalen finished. Understanding. The same mental fortitude required to purge memories was needed to disseminate them safely. He walked to the core and placed his hand on a designated interface. Do it. He felt a surge of cold as the neural link engaged. Then came the flood. It was not just data. It was experience. A billion lifetimes slammed into his consciousness at once. He heard the soaring symphony of a forgotten composer, felt the passionate sermon of a dead prophet, saw the vibrant colors of an artist's final masterpiece. He felt the terror of the first shots of the unraveling, the fierce love of a mother for her child, the quiet joy of a scientist's discovery, the bitter hatred of a soldier on a forgotten battlefield. It was too much. His mind, his fortress, began to crack under the strain. The pain was excruciating, a death by 1,000 feelings. Don't just endure it, Kalen. Anya's voice cut through the storm, a lifeline in the maelstrom. You are not a dam. You are a lens. Focus it. Find me. He searched through the chaos, not for a file or a name, but for a feeling, for the specific frequency of her grief and defiance. He found it, a single, pure note in the roaring symphony, the memory of Meridian. He grabbed onto it, using it as an anchor, a focal point. Now, she commanded, show them. Show them the price of their cage. Show them what they lost. Show them how to be beautifully, terribly, gloriously alive again. He opened the floodgates. On Cygnus X1, Elara stood on the bridge of the Quietude, watching in horror as the stars painted by the populace began to move, the eyes in the darkness seeming to blink in unison. The static was not just erasing the station, it was consuming it, digesting its order. But then, a new signal ripped through the system. A song. A soaring, heart-breaking piece of music from old Earth. The painters stopped, their heads snapping up. Their vacant eyes began to clear, replaced by confusion. Then shock. Then a dawning, painful awareness. Across the Concord, on 100 worlds and in 1,000 habitats, the broadcast arrived. Minds that had known only the sterile peace of regulated thought were suddenly flooded with the raw, unfiltered chaos of their own heritage. In silent factoriums, workers dropped their tools and began to weep for tragedies they had never known. In sterile creches, children began to laugh with a wild, unrestrained joy that had been bred out of the populace for generations. In the cold halls of power, functionaries screamed as the ghosts of their ancestors filled their minds with love and rage. The great silence was broken. Kalen had unleashed the storm. Back in the spire, he felt the static recoil, not in pain, but in confusion. The perfect, simple pattern of the Concorde was gone, replaced by a screaming, unpredictable hurricane of mimetic energy. The smooth, sandy beach had become a reef of jagged coral overnight, but the storm was raging inside him, too. He was the epicenter, and the hurricane of human emotion was tearing him apart. He knew he couldn't hold the focus for long. He had given humanity back its soul, its beautiful, dangerous chaos. Now, he could only pray they wouldn't use it to tear themselves apart all over again before the monster in the dark decided to stop nibbling and simply devour the entire reef. The cure had been administered, but the fate of the patient was far from certain. The broadcast was a psychic nova, and Kalen was its incandescent heart. He stood locked to the archive core, the history of a species screaming through his mind, his body a mere vessel for the storm. Outside the silent spire, humanity awoke from its 100-year slumber into a world of violent, beautiful color. On a terraforming rig orbiting Mars, a technician who had only ever known the quiet satisfaction of a balanced equation suddenly felt the soaring triumph of the first explorers cresting Olympus Mons, and wept. In the deep-sea arcologies of Europa, citizens who had lived in regulated, silent harmony were gripped by the collective terror of their ancestors fleeing a dying Earth, and they held each other for the first time in generations, not for function, but for comfort. But the awakening was not all beautiful. In the dense hab blocks of Neo-Kyoto, the sudden influx of ancestral rage and tribalism ignited flash riots. Ancient, forgotten hatreds, buried for a century, resurfaced with the ferocity of a plague. Humanity was alive again, and it was already threatening to tear itself apart. Kalen felt it all. Every surge of joy, every spasm of violence. He was the fulcrum on which a species teetered between rebirth and self-destruction. The strain was immense, a constant psychic crucifixion. His nose bled freely, and the veins in his temples stood out like cords. He was dying, burning out like a star that had gone supernova, and the static was adapting. It had recoiled from the initial blast of chaos, but it was a being of immense, ancient intelligence. It could not consume the hurricane, but it could find the eye of the storm. It began to push back, not with a wave of negation, but with a focused, surgical pressure aimed directly at Kalen's mind. It didn't use fear or pain. It used his own past, his own nature, against him. A logic scalpel. It whispered in the cold. Clear language of an inquisitor. This is chaos. This is the unraveling you were born to prevent. Look at them. They are animals. They need a cage. It showed him visions of the riots, the bloodshed. It amplified the pain and the madness. You can end this. You are the conduit. Close the gate. Restore the silence. Silence is peace. Silence is sanity. The temptation was agonizing, the promise of release, of quiet, of an end to the screaming symphony of ghosts in his head, was the most seductive thing he had ever known. He felt his will begin to buckle, his control over the broadcast wavering. Kaelin. Fight it, Valeria shouted from across the chamber. She was watching his biometrics flatline on a monitor. Don't let it win. But he was losing. The sheer weight of 1 billion heartbeats was crushing him. Then, in the heart of the storm, Anya's voice returned, not as a commander, but as a gentle guide. It's right about one thing, Kaelin. This is chaos. And chaos alone is just another tyrant. You've opened the box. Now you must show them what to build with what's inside. I can't, he thought, his consciousness fraying. It's too much. The pain. Then stop bearing it. Start shaping it. She urged. A memory is not just a weapon. It's a lesson. You haven't just unleashed their history. You've given them back their mistakes. Now, show them that they also have the capacity to learn from them. Anya's presence flared within him. A final, brilliant surge of energy. She gave him her last gift. It wasn't more knowledge or power. It was perspective. The ability to see the pattern within the chaos. He understood. He had been a passive conduit, a broken dam. Now, he became a curator, a storyteller. He stopped broadcasting the raw, unfiltered data stream. He began to weave the threads together. He sent them the image of a city burning during the unraveling, but followed it immediately with the memory of its citizens' enemies just hours before, working together to pull survivors from the rubble. He broadcast the sound of a hateful sermon from a forgotten demagogue, but overlaid it with the quiet, defiant poetry of those the sermon condemned. He showed them the creation of the conquered, the lie of Meridian, the sterile peace of the cage, but then he showed them his own journey, the awakening of an inquisitor, the proof that even the most rigid mind could choose to change. He wasn't just giving them back their past. He was giving them a narrative of resilience, a blueprint for hope. He showed them that for every act of destruction, there was an act of creation. For every moment of despair, a moment of grace. He was teaching them, in a single, desperate broadcast, the most human art of all the art of finding meaning in the beautiful, terrible mess of existence. The effect was instantaneous. The psychic frequency of the broadcast shifted. It was no longer a chaotic scream, but a complex, multi-layered symphony. It was still wild and unpredictable, but it now had harmony. It had purpose. The static recoiled. This new pattern was anathema to it. It was a pattern made of chaos, a form of logic built from emotion. It was indigestible, a paradox. It could not consume it. It could not understand it. For the first time in millennia, the great and silent predator of the void felt something akin to frustration, with a final, lingering psychic hiss that felt like a promise of return. It withdrew, retreating into the profound darkness between galaxies. In the silent spire, the pressure vanished. The broadcast ended. The crystalline core dimmed, its rainbow of light fading to a soft, steady silver. Kalen collapsed, the neural link severing as his body hit the floor. He had given everything. He awoke days later in a medical bay. Valerius was sitting by his bedside. The Tower of Inquisition was no longer silent. Through the window, he could hear the faint, distant sounds of the city shouts, music, arguments, laughter, the sound of life. "You did it," she said, her voice holding a note of awe. "It's gone. For now." "And them," Kalen asked, his own voice a dry rasp. "Humanity, they're a mess," Valerius admitted, a faint, weary smile touching her lips for the first time. "They're terrified, confused, and angry. They're also creating, singing, and forming councils. They tore down the Ministry of Concordance, but they didn't burn the archives. They've started calling it the Library of Choices. The Great Silence is over. The Great Conversation has just begun." Kalen closed his eyes. Anya was gone. Her echo had faded. Her promise fulfilled. He was just a man again. A man who had dismantled a galaxy-spanning empire with a single, forbidden story. In the years that followed, humanity did not create a utopia. It created something far more interesting. Worlds grappled with their newfound histories, old faiths were reborn, and new philosophies were forged. There was conflict, but there was also art. There was pain, but there was also progress. They were no longer a perfectly ordered, silent machine. They were a noisy, chaotic, and gloriously imperfect garden, growing in 1,000 different directions at once. Kalen was never an inquisitor again. He vanished from public life, his name becoming a legend, the ghost who remembers, the man who broke the cage. Some said he went to the fringes to watch the stars and listen for the return of the static. Others said he simply found a quiet place to live, to feel the sun on his face, a pleasure he had never known. On Cygnus X1, where the first visual echo had appeared, the station was not scrubbed clean. The paintings were preserved under protective fields, a permanent gallery of their awakening. One day, a young girl stood before the mural of the black glass field and the burning towers. She held a datapad, not for work, but for play. On its screen, she was drawing. It wasn't a perfect geometric shape, nor a random, chaotic splash of color. It was a messy, asymmetrical, 5-pointed star, shining brightly against a dark background. It was a star born of choice, flawed and beautiful. It was a star that knew the darkness, and shone anyway. And in the silent spaces between its points, there were no longer hungry eyes, only endless possibility.